How are we today?
Yeah.
Seriously?
Yeah.
All right. All right, before we get into picking up the No More Religion series this morning, I do want to recognize that it is Mother's Day, and so those of you that have the chance to, make sure that you reach out to your moms in some way. If you have that opportunity, I hope that you will take advantage of it. But if you're a mom or a soon-to-be mom, would you stand up? Yeah, just stay up for a while, and we're going to recognize all the ladies in the crowd. Moms, every person in this room, mom or otherwise, we all have this calling from God in our lives, and really it's a calling about relating to Him, and it's about living out the lives He called us to live. And it's certainly included in that is investing in other people. And I just want you to know as moms that those of you who are getting ready to be moms, those of you who have moms of young children, teenagers, that day's coming for us, I guess. And those of you that your kids are grown, I just want to say that what you have done, what you are doing, what you will do is just such a huge investment. And it's a big, big deal in God's eyes. It's a big, big deal for us here at the church. So moms, we do want to salute you. Now, all women and girls, I'd love for you to stand up. All of you ladies, stay up, moms. Every woman in the house this morning, come on. Or any of you girls, come on. We want to, come on, guys. Stand up. The men here at this church are incredibly valued. And so such a part of everything that we've done since the beginning has been on the shoulders of so many of the ladies in our church. And as we continue to move forward and make a difference here in the city and really in the world, ladies, we're depending on you, and we love you, we care about you, and we value you. And so we want you to know that what you do in your lives is huge, relationally, vocationally, through this church, serving, those kind of things. So ladies, thanks so much. You can have a seat. And on this Mother's Day, I certainly understand that it's not a joyous occasion for every person. I know some of you in this room have lost your mom since the last Mother's Day. And so I just want to, I'm not going to ask you to stand, but I just want you to know, some of you that know your stories, many of you know my story, losing my mom, probably a long time ago now when I was 25. And for those of you that have lost a mom since last Mother's Day, I just want you to say, we hurt with you. And I'd love to say, hey, it's not going to be as tough next Mother's Day as it is today, but in some ways it will always be tough, even as the one's not as fresh going on. So I just want to recognize you. I want you to know God's heart is in this with you. Our heart, my heart as a pastor here, is in this with you. And then I also know that there's some of you ladies, kind of like Shauna and I right now, not that I'm like a lady, but like us, you ache for the opportunity to have children or to have a specific child, like we are awaiting a child from India. And our hope and prayer that this time next year that we will have her in the house. Otherwise, we'll probably go crazy. I'll probably go crazy. But and so those of you that are longing for that, just want you to know that there's a lot of emotion that comes around this idea. Hopefully you had a great mom. Some of you didn't. That's just reality. Some of you have had children. Some of you want to. Some of you have lost your parents. And so as a guy who's lost a mom, I know there might be a bunch of stuff between you and your mom. I just want to encourage you to go towards reconciliation. If that's your story, no matter what she's done to hurt you, no matter what that looks like and what it feels like, and I know I don't know the ins and outs, but if there's a chance for you to do it once she's alive, I would encourage you to do it. So anyway, that's all I'll say about that. We are continuing our No More Religion series, and to begin, I just want to say that every single day of my life and every single day of your lives, we rely on things and people to get through our day, right? We do. It starts right off the bat in the morning. We're relying on an alarm clock. True? Now, what time is your alarm clock set? I mean, what are you relying on? You're relying on it to go off at what time? Come on.
5:15.
Everyone that just said something with a 5, they're feeling arrogant in regards to the rest of us all of a sudden. We don't care. You can have it. 5 is all yours. There's a huge vacancy in the 5 range for the alarm clock, so have it. But when you set your alarm, whatever time it is, for me it's 6 o'clock, sometimes 5:45, just make sure that it's annoying enough and loud enough and reliable enough that it's going to make sure that you get up in the morning. What's the very next thing, and you all are going to participate out loud, once your alarm clock goes off, you rely on it, what's the very next thing that you rely on? Coffee. Snooze button, it's part of the alarm clock. But for so many of us, coffee's the next thing. We are, and we really need the coffee pot to be more reliable than any other friend we encounter that day, right? I mean, we need to be able to power through those first few hours. We need the alarm clock. We need our jobs. But more than that, we need some cups of goodness. And that's the only way we're going to get through the day for so many of us. And we need it to be reliable. I've got to be honest. My wife went out of town last weekend for 4 nights. And this is an indictment on me. I say this all the time. I don't have any marketable skills, and really, I don't have any skills at all. I've not learned yet how to make coffee. And so it was a struggle last week because she's so golden, she's so reliable, and every morning she sets it the night before, and it's great. So I'm going to figure that out. That's my one goal for 2013. I'm pretty ambitious. But really, it's one of those things that's necessary. And then once you get ready for the day, all of a sudden you begin relying on transportation, right? So some of you, how many of you walk? Like that's your mode of transportation? You walk to work? Anybody walk? Yeah, y'all. That's impressive. 9:30 crowd had about 2 hands up, and it was a record 9:30 crowd this morning. So it's not high ratio of walkers. How many of you bike to work?
Yeah.
I'm looking into getting a bike. I'm actually looking today. I don't know. I can't see if it's safe yet or not. But I'm looking into it. How many of you are on the Muni, either the light rail or the bus? Muni, bus, or light rail? Yeah, every day, a lot of you. How many of you are like me? You're on the BART sometime in the morning, evening? Anybody ride the BART across the city or across the Bay Area? Okay, that's me too. And then some of you, the arrogant ones in the room. How many of you have the company bus thing pick you up? Just get it up. Come on, Jack. You're like, life is so hard. I just don't know if it's going to show up on time, and traffic's so bad at 101. And I've got to watch all the seasons of my favorite TV show. But we depend on whatever mode of transportation we take. We're depending on that it's going to show up, when it's supposed to show up, where it's supposed to show up, and it's going to take us where you need to be. We're relying on things all throughout the day. You get into the office, you open up that computer, and you're relying on your email server to provide the messages that you need that are essential, and most of the ones that aren't, right? We're going to show up, you're depending, you're relying on something to give you the messages you need for the day, and then you get a lunch break, and you go to your lunch appointment, and you are relying on the person whom you made an appointment with you to actually show up, right? It's really incredible what we rely on every day without even realizing it. Even when you go to pay for lunch, you're trusting that your credit is still in good shape, right? You're like, all right, this is going to work, and then you've got some deal how you can make amends for that if it doesn't work out, like, oh, that's my card, it's expired or something, okay? Which makes you really look weird in front of the people you're with if you don't have a card that works. And then other things we rely on, I don't know about you, but our staff just joined a local gym, and I'm relying on my gym membership to make me incredibly fit. I paid good money for it. The membership alone is reliable, right? Who cares how often we show up? By the way, for our staff, I set some minimal standards for how often we have to go per month, and because I'm a part of it, I didn't say what we had to do when we got there. So we just have to show up X amount of times per month, and there's no time limit, and there's no one watching us. And we have this app where we can show that we at least checked in at the gym that day. Who cares how long it lasted? But we're relying on things all the time. In fact, as you purchase small things and big things, one of the questions, you want it to look cool, you want it to be awesome, but at the end of the day, the reason we buy stuff is we need it to work. Right? It needs to be reliable. When you buy a car, no matter if it's old, new, big, small, you need it to look. You may want it to look cool, but you have to have it reliable. If you're high up in your organization or you lead some team and you hire individuals, one of the questions, if you're not asking it, you need to start asking it is he or is she, are they reliable? You need to know, are they reliable? Even when it comes to the philosophies of life that we've developed for ourselves, the question that goes with this as well is our philosophy of life, is our method or our way of life, is it reliable? And as we pick up the No More Religion series this morning, this whole idea is based off this letter that Paul, who was an apostle in the first century, he wrote a letter to some churches in a place called Galatia. And one of the things, this happened in the first century, and one of the things he's going to say to them, and the question he's going to ask them, is a question I want to ask us this morning. Here it is. What are you relying on to gain acceptance from God? What are you relying on to gain acceptance from God? Here's why I'm really excited about this message. This is a message for every person in the room. For the person who's been a mature Christian for 30 years, and the person in the room who's new to this whole faith thing, and all of us in between, this question is for all of us. It's not a thing for people who aren't Christians. It's not simply a thing for people who are. For all of us, you need to be able to ask and answer the question, what are you relying on when it comes to being accepted by God? Or another way to say it, what are you relying on when it comes to your standing with God? And the question I have for you is what you're relying on, is it actually reliable? Right? The Galatians that we're going to read about, they were relying on something to get acceptance from God. You are relying on something to get acceptance from God, and I'm relying on something to get acceptance from God. And the question, the real one theme for today is this, as we get into Galatians chapter 3 in just a moment. The theme for today is this: what are we relying on, and is it reliable? So, if you have a Bible, you can take one out, Galatians chapter 3. If you need a Bible, Geraldine and Diana and others have Bibles in their hands. I'd love just to give you one. Let me encourage you, whatever smartphone you use, if you have one of those, or iPad, whatever, download the Bible. It's actually free, and when you're on that company bus, you can probably read the whole Bible. In fact, if you work for one of those companies, someone probably reads it to you. But seriously, whenever you survey people and you're asking, like people that have grown in their faith, how have you grown? Lots of answers come out, but here's one thing that's always consistent. This is just an aside this morning. Here's one thing that's always consistent. People that are growing in their faith are spending some time at least, even if it's 5 to 10 minutes, every day reading their Bibles and praying. A lot of other things you can do. You can fast, you can journal, you can meditate. Lots of things you can do. Lots of great books to read. But if you want to like, hey, what's foundational? What's really, there's no magic pill here. But getting into the scriptures a little bit every day, on most days at least, and getting some time in to pray with God. And so I just encourage you, no matter where you're at in your understanding, or even how many Bibles you own or don't own, I would just encourage you, if you have a smartphone or something like that, download the Bible. YouVersion is a great app. ESV that we teach from here is a great free app as well. So let me just encourage you along those lines. If you have one of the Bibles we just handed out, we're on page 631. For the rest of us, Galatians chapter 3. Would you all stand with me? We'll look at chapter 3, verses 1 through 14. And again, the question I want every person to be just considering in your own mind and your own heart, based on kind of your spiritual journey. The question is this: when it comes to your standing before God, being accepted by this God, what is it that you're relying on? And is what you're relying on, is it reliable? It's a huge question. That's really where we'll center in for the rest of our time. Chapter 3, verse 1. Paul says, O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified. Let me ask you only this: did you receive the Spirit by works of the law, or by hearing with faith? Are you so foolish? Having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh? Did you suffer so many things in vain, if indeed it was in vain? Does he who supplies the Spirit to you and works miracles among you do so by works of the law, or by hearing with faith? Just as Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Know then that it is those of faith who are the sons of Abraham. And the Scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, in you shall all the nations be blessed. So then, those who are of faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. Verse 10. Here's that word rely. For all who rely on works of the law are under a curse. For it is written, cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law and do them. Now it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law. For the righteous shall live by faith. But the law is not of faith, rather the one who does them shall live by them. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree, so that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we might receive the promised Spirit through faith. You may be seated. A little bit of a lengthy text, but I want you to see it in its entirety because it really does deal with this one thing. And as you go back, and I don't know if you'll look through the scripture again throughout the week, I encourage you to, but as you go back, the one idea again is what we're trusting in, is it reliable? The word reliable literally just means able to be trusted or dependable. Is what you're relying on regarding your standing before God, your acceptance before God, is it reliable? Now Paul begins verse 1 by asking this question: who has bewitched you? Here's what he's saying: who has tricked you? Who has, the word there is, who has cast some magic spell on you that you're starting to believe something different than what I told you? For the sake of review, let me remind you how Galatians got going if you haven't been tracking with the series. Paul writes this letter to the Galatians because of this. Paul had gone and he had made disciples in Galatia, and they had started churches. Just like Epic started 2 years ago, Paul was starting churches in the region of Galatia. And he was telling them, here's the good news. Jesus died for you. He made you acceptable to God. Paul vacates Galatia, not for bad reasons, but he's going to plant other churches throughout Asia. So he leaves some people in charge there in Galatia. He moves on to plant other churches. And when he leaves Galatia, you have these false teachers come in, and they're like, yes, Paul had part of the message right, but in addition to what Jesus has done for you, you need to do all of these other things. You need to adhere to the law. You need to be circumcised if you're a male, on and on and on and on. And so Paul is writing back to the churches in Galatia saying, how did you let them fool you? How did you let these false teachers invade your churches and begin teaching you things that are contrary to what I taught you? Okay, that's the big idea. So who has tricked you? And then he says, you know Jesus Christ, in verse 1, Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified. Now to get the whole idea, why would Paul connect these two? He's saying, who tricked you? And then he's talking about Jesus being crucified. So to be able to understand it, look back at the last verse of chapter 2, if you have a Bible open. Chapter 2, verse 21. This is the only way that it'll help make sense. This is where Will, who taught for me last week, this is where he left off. In verse 21, it says, Paul writing, I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for, say that with me, for nothing or no purpose. What is his argument? Why is he saying, who tricked you? And then he's saying, Jesus was crucified. Here's what his argument was. Basically, leaving off of where we found ourselves in 2:21. He's saying this, when I came to you and I taught you the reason that you're acceptable by God is through the death of Jesus on your behalf, nothing you can do for yourself, you believe that. But now what you're trying to do is do enough works and follow the law so that you can gain acceptance before God. He's saying if you can do something to get to God and you don't need Jesus, then Jesus died for no purpose and his death was actually pointless. You see the logic there? He's got an incredible mind. If you love logic and reasoning, Paul is an amazing person and just giving great logic and great rationale behind why we should believe certain things. So he's saying to the Galatians this, because they were, it wasn't that they quit believing, probably the crucifixion of Jesus, but they just didn't think it was enough. And Paul is saying to them, if it wasn't enough, then there's no point in it. Does that make sense? For us, here's what we need to reconcile. We cannot simultaneously believe that the death of Jesus makes us right with God and think that we have to do things to be right with God. Now, all of us, at least if you're like me, you've struggled with this. I can assent to this cross idea and still try to think that I've got to do enough good works to get myself to God. Does that make sense? So I can say, yeah, I know the cross. I'm not oblivious to that. I know Jesus died. But then I can start saying, I've got to do this, this, and this to get myself to God. And do you understand how those can't both exist? Right? It comes down to that reliability thing we've been talking about. Who are you relying on? If it's Jesus, then it's done. If it's you, then he died for no reason. It's a really interesting truth, and I don't want to overstate it, but I just want to continue to say, if you are looking to the crucifixion of Jesus, but then still acting like you've got to get yourself to God, then what you're essentially saying is, Jesus, although the cross seems like a sentimental thing for you maybe, Jesus didn't really have to do that for you because you are going to have to do something for yourself. And Paul continues this rationale. Look at verse 2. He's going to talk about how they began and now what they're into. He says this, let me ask you this question. Did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or by hearing with faith? What he's saying is this, when you became followers of Jesus, was it by what you did or did you place faith in what Jesus had done for you? Okay, he's going to say, how did you begin? He's going to continue the argument in verse 3. He says, are you so foolish? Having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh? Now here's what's going on with the Galatians. And maybe you can relate. I know that I can. In the beginning of them coming to terms with a relationship with God, they knew that they needed grace. Hopefully you recognize that too in the beginning. They knew that they could do nothing of themselves to get themselves to God. That there's a holy God, that they, like every human that's ever lived, exception of Jesus, is a sinful human being, and there's this great gulf between God and humanity. So they knew that. So they knew to get into that relationship with God, they needed grace. But once they got that grace, as they were advancing in their faith with and in God, they thought that now it's up to them to make it happen. Does that make sense? So like they started with grace, but now they're going on to their flesh or to the works of the law to see what can they do. Now that God's gotten them in, what can they do? Here's what I think about. There's a really cool thing going on in our church right now, and so many of you are part of it, where we have people in our church that work for specific companies and organizations or have their own businesses, and then we get other people who come to the staff or other leaders in our church, and they're like, hey, I'm looking for a job, and they let us know the field, and they let us know what kind of companies they're looking at. This is one of my favorite things right now. And then what I try to do, or whoever tries to do, is you try to connect them to one another, which is really cool. And here's what I say to people. So if I know someone that works at whatever company, let's say someone works at the Gap, which is true in our church, and someone says, hey, I'm looking for a job at the Gap, here's what I will tell the person. Hey, I will introduce you to so-and-so, but once I get you in the door, it's on you to make it go. Does that make sense? Like, I'm going to do the introductions, I'll do the email, we'll get together for breakfast or coffee or lunch, and then, listen, just because you're part of Epic, if you're, like, you have no skills, you're probably not getting the job. All right? I'll get you in the door, but then it's on you. Some of us treat our faith that way. Let Jesus' death get us in the door with God, but then we'll take it from there. And what Paul is saying to the Galatians is, hey, realize the death of Jesus that gets you in the door is the same death and the same means by which you stay and grow as a Christian. What happens for many of us is we get in by grace, but then we start going to effort, right? I get in by grace. I know myself too well. I know that I needed the grace of Jesus, but now I try to find myself going, wait, do I have to be a good enough husband to be accepted by God? Do I have to be a good enough father to get God's acceptance? Do I have to be a good enough pastor? What can I do? What am I not supposed to do so that I can get accepted by God? And what Paul's saying to the Galatians, and what we need to hear this morning is this. You relied on something Jesus did for you to get into a relationship with God. Continue to rely on that to move forward in your relationship with God. It's a really interesting point that if we're not careful, because most things in life, right, there's an orientation or there's an initial way things work, but then we get into an advanced setting, right? Like when you went to your job, I assume you had orientation, and they took it really easy and slow on you, and the next week it's like, all right, you better make it happen. Things change, right? You start on a diet, you stay in one diet for a while, then it's like, all right, let's go on to the advanced theme. So sometimes the Galatians, and even for us, we can think, well, we got in because of the grace of Jesus, because of his death, but now we've got to move on to something else, and so we set that aside and we begin to rely on what we can do to gain acceptance to God. And Paul's just saying, if you're going to rely on that, you're going to end up in trouble. Look at what he says in verse 4. He's like, did we suffer so many things? Verse 5. Did he, that's God who supplies the Spirit, did God do it by your works or by faith? Or by faith. So faith is how you enter the Christian life. It's also how you grow as a Christian. And it's also how you remain accepted by God. Faith, not just general like faith, like, oh, I believe in something, but faith in what Jesus has done on our behalf and in our behalf. And then he starts talking about Abraham, how Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and how we can become, through faith, sons of Abraham. Here was the deal. You guys know the song Father Abraham? Anybody know the song? Thanks for not shaking your head no. And you're like, no, teach us. But I wouldn't. But Lindsay's great. Lindsay's great when it comes to children's songs. Anyway, that's you can pay her later. But the reason the song's about that God had entered into covenant with Abraham and said, hey, you're going to be a father of many nations. Well, the reason that was peculiar to Abraham is because he's like 75, then 80, then 95, then 99 years old, and he doesn't have one kid. In fact, by that time he was that old, the Bible says that Abraham was as good as dead, but God kept saying, I'm going to give you a son, and I'm going to give you many sons and daughters. You will be a father of many nations, and yet he's not a father of one. But he believed God. He didn't always do it well. He didn't listen to a message we did in the Status Quo series. He didn't always have great faith, but overall he was a man of faith. Here's what Abraham did, and then I'm going to show you how we're like Abraham in this text. Abraham was looking forward to God's provision of a son. Does that make sense? So he believed God would do it, and God credited righteousness to him because of his faith. This is what God does to us. But whereas Abraham's looking forward in faith for what God will provide, what God invites us to do is look back to the cross of Jesus and believe that by faith, God has provided something for us, namely a way for us to be reconciled, be at peace with God. That's what Jesus' cross is all about. And so he's like, you're just like Abraham. You're like a son or daughter of Abraham because you are looking for God's provision. Now, Abraham had to look ahead and believe by faith, but we have to look back to the cross and by faith believe that that is God's provision for us. And when we see the cross, what God's inviting us to do is to rely on the cross and not on our works to gain access to God. To gain access to God. And again, the question as we get into verse 10, the question for you and for me is this: what are you relying on for your standing with God? What are you relying on for your standing with God? When you get up in the morning and you think about how you relate to God, what are you relying on? Many hours later, when you come back to that same pillow and you think about how the day went, what are you relying on? When you've had your best day, what are you relying on? When you've blown it, what are you relying on? When God seems distant, what are you relying on? When it seems like He's right there, what is it that you are relying on? And here's what Paul says to the Galatians in verse 10. He says, all who rely on works of the law are under a curse. He says, cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law and do them. But here's what he's saying. If you are going to rely on upholding the law, you have to uphold it at every single point. And guess what? You guys are awesome, but you can't uphold the law. And I can't uphold the law. We can't do it. If you seek to rely on your own efforts to gain standing before God, listen to what happens. Your life is filled with pressure, anxiety, and insecurity. Why? Because you'll never know if you've done enough. Is God happy yet? Is He okay with me now? Is the list completed? You will never know. And so here's what Paul says in verse 11. He says that it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law. Here's what that means. That you cannot be made righteous by the law. Here's what the law does. The law has a very important part. It can't make us right with God. You know what the law can do? It can only show us where we're wrong with God. Let me tell you this again. The law can't make us one with God. It can't reconcile us. All it does, and it's a very important job that it does, what it does is show us God's standards and how we fail to live up to them. That was the purpose of the law. Now, at Epic, we use this word gospel a pretty good bit, but we want to unpack it. The gospel literally means good news. The gospel is this, basically that God sent His Son Jesus to become sin for us, to pay our punishment on the cross. He rose from the dead, overcoming sin and death, and by faith, we can have a relationship with God, and God can see us as righteous through Jesus. That's a big deal. That's what the gospel is. It's good news. But if you don't get the law, then you will never love the gospel. Does that make sense? Like, good news isn't good news unless I know how bad and despairing the bad news is. That's what he's trying to say. What the law does, it can't justify you. You can't be good. You can't even follow the 10 commandments today, and then God's going to accept you. The commandments, those 10 and the other 600, they were given so that you might see that you can't make it on your own. And so that when Jesus shows up in history, we're like, wow, thank you, God, because I couldn't get there by myself. That's the point. The law is showing us how desperately we are in need of the gospel. It is not saying, hey, here's your there are about 600 commands, right? 600 commands. It's not saying do these 600 and you get in with God. It's saying, hey, let me show you. You can't do these, but Jesus is coming, and now for us, He has come. He has paid a price, and thereby we can rely on what He's done, and we don't have to do enough to get in. Here's what Tim Keller says in his book, Galatians for You. He says, whatever we live by will essentially be the bottom line of our lives. What gives us meaning, confidence, and definition. Here's what he's saying. If you live by the law and your efforts, then your confidence is going to be based not in God or Jesus. Your confidence is going to be based on how good have you been lately. Right? Your meaning in life is going to be based on have you measured up yet. Your definition, what you will be defined by, is how bad or how good you've been. Here's the deal. If you rely on the works of the law, if you rely on your good efforts, it's all going to be on you. You've felt that way before, right? I got to do it. I got to do more. I got to show up. I got to read my Bible. I got to go to church. Oh man, I got to be a good husband. I can't raise my voice. I can't lose my temper. I got to get up early. Right? It's going to be on you. It's on you there. If you rely on Jesus, guess what? He invites us to do this. If we rely on Jesus, it's not on you. It's on Him. He's pretty reliable. Not taking days off. He doesn't have to ask himself the question every day, have I been good enough? Here's what happens. If you rely on yourself, and some of you will recognize this question, maybe you ask it in a different form. If you rely on yourself to get your standing with God right, here's the question you have to ask every day, and perhaps moment by moment. Here it is. Have I done enough? You ever lived that life, or am I the only one? Right? If you rely on you every day, and probably many times a day, you got to go, have I done enough? Did I make the mark? Did I cross the line? But here's what's so cool. When you rely on the grace of Jesus alone, through faith alone in Him and what He's done on your behalf, here's the question you get to ask. Has Jesus done enough? Who do you want to rely on? I know you're great. I get it. But not always. Isn't that so freeing? We want to rely on ourselves, but at the end of the day, if we're honest, even on our best days, we know we can't be reliable for this. You can do some things, sure, but you can't close the gap between you and where God is. But Jesus does that, and so we can ask the question, has He done enough? And that answer is always the same. Even when you're addicted to stuff you shouldn't be addicted to. Even when you are absent when it comes to your best and closest relationships. Even when you don't have integrity at the office, Jesus still closes the gap. It's on Him. It's on Him. He's reliable. You and I can rely on Him. That's what verse 11 really is all about. And then you get to 13 and you get this beautiful picture of why we can rely on Him. It says that Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hanging on a tree. So again, let me remind you that when you see the cross, this is not a sentimental thing for us. This is not Jesus doing something and endearing Himself to us. This is Jesus receiving the curse we earn so that we might receive the blessing that He has earned. Cursed is everyone who is hanging on a tree. Cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree. So here's what I want to land this thing before we finish this morning. There are two extremes, and I want to help you not go to either one when it comes to our works, our good efforts, the works of the law. One extreme is this, that I've got to do enough good works to get myself to God. I've got to appease God. He's up here. I've got to do this, this, and this, and I've got to do enough to get myself to God. That's one extreme. The other extreme is for people to think they understand the gospel and say, well, God accepts me. Works play no part in my life. Right? And most of us have been on one or maybe both extremes, like, oh, I've got to do, or it doesn't matter what I do because I'm in. Let me give you the alternate. Let me give you another way, and I want to invite everyone in this room, Christian or non-Christian, to find and rest in what I'm about to share with you in regards to the relationship between faith and works. I want to borrow from a few sentences from Paul in the letter he wrote to the church in Ephesus. So I'm going to give you Ephesians. It's just the next book over to the right if you have your Bible still open. If not, I'll give it to you. I'm going to give you Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 10, because it's a beautiful picture of the relationship that our faith has with our works. But if we get it backwards, we will be messed up. I want to give you verses 8 and 9, and then we'll pause and talk about that and then get into verse 10. Verses 8 and 9, here's what it said. Here's what Paul writes to the church in Ephesus. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. Now let's just go bit by bit. He says, for it is by grace, meaning that it is something given to you that you don't deserve. It is something bestowed to you that you don't deserve. It is not conditioned. It is not determined by your actions or your inactions. It is not determined by your purity or your impurity. It is not determined by how many times you got it right or how many times you got it wrong. It is grace. For by grace you have been saved. We've been saved from what? Saved from our sins and the penalty of our sins, which is death. Physical death and spiritual death. We've been saved. What have we been saved through? You always want to know, what's my part in this bin? If it's all grace, what do I do? What's my part? Your part is through faith. Faith in, not just blind faith, but faith in what Jesus has done on your behalf. So it's by grace, freely given. You've been saved from your sin through faith, faith in what Jesus has done. And this is not your own doing. Now, some of you are frustrated at this point. You like accomplishing things. This is not your own doing. The response you should get to this is freedom. Wow. This is not my own doing. Say it with me. It's the gift of God. It's handed to you. It's bestowed upon you. Then he goes on in verse 9. I love this next phrase. It's not a result of works. Not a result of works. So this person over here is like, oh, works don't matter. We'll get to you. Not a result of works, so that no one may boast. Here's how you enter the Christian life. Through faith in what God has done for you through Jesus on your behalf, which you could not do for yourself. If you think you have a relationship with God based on anything else, me just taking my job seriously here this morning, you don't. You don't. You cannot earn it. The beautiful good news is you don't have to. Isn't that good? You don't have to. You can rest in it. Well, here's where works comes in. Look at verse 10. For we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. So you're accepted by grace through faith, not a result of your works, but you were created for works. You get it? So what's God's intention for your life? First, that you would surrender and go, wait, I can't do this, but I don't have to do it. It's not me getting myself to God. It's God getting Himself through the death of Jesus to me. But I respond with works. Not to gain His acceptance, right? It's not a result of works. And isn't it cool, no matter how young or how old you are, no matter if you're even considering yourself a Christian or not this morning, no matter how many times you've blown it or gotten it right, no matter how much you know about the Bible, how familiar you are with church, isn't it amazing that every human being in this room was created to do good works by God? But I don't think we can be free to do good works until we allow the pressure to go on Jesus and get off our backs. He can handle it. He has handled it. He's not dying every day for your sin. He did it once and for all to bring you to God. And some of us just need to rest in that. If you're not a Christian this morning, I want to just encourage you to find something reliable here. Just to find these reliable. Quit asking the question, will you do enough? Aren't you good enough? People want to know all the time, Ben, I know they're not a Christian, but they've got to be good enough to get to heaven. If anybody could be, they probably would be, but you can't. You need something called grace. If you are a Christian, understand that this is for you. In fact, Paul's writing church. And some of you that have even been Christians a long time, let me ask you this and really pry into my own heart here. When's the last time you tasted grace? I know that's how you got in. I know there was some recognition as an 8-year-old or an 18-year-old or a 48-year-old. I know that's where it started. You responded to the message that I just gave these non-Christians. But when's the last time you tasted grace? For me, it's tough. I evaluate myself every day, sometimes hour by hour. Am I a good enough pastor? Am I a good enough man? Am I spending the right kind of time with the right people? And I need to evaluate that, but not to see where I stand with God. I need to look back at the cross to see where I stand with God. You've been invited to do the same. I'd love for you to stand as we pray and kind of close up this moment. I've asked the band to come up, and they're going to, and they're going to do this song that really, the song is called God is Able, but another way to think about it is that God is reliable. That if you're going to rely on yourself or a God who overcame death, I don't think I need to tell you where you need to turn. If there's something you want to talk about with the staff throughout the week, certainly you can let us know that today. You can also let us know that on your card, through emails. But I just want to ask you before we close, and I want you to really hear what they're going to sing and say, is what you're relying on to gain acceptance from God, is it reliable? If it's about you, it's probably not. It's about Jesus, and we can ask the question of Him every day, Jesus, have you done enough for this? It's embarrassing sometimes because we know our sin. It's always humbling because we recognize what He's done. It's a great question to live under. Has Jesus done enough for me to stand before God? Can I find my righteousness there? I hope that you can and that you will. And that we as a church will rest in this and live under this banner. God, I pray that you will continue to make this true in our hearts and our minds. God, great logic from Paul. We're so blown away that Jesus didn't die a purposeless or pointless death. God, no matter how long we have a relationship with you or whether we're just starting one or we haven't begun one, God, the only hope we have is grace. Jesus, you died. You were cursed so that we might be blessed. May we not move quickly past that fall. You've overcome what we could not overcome. You, of your own initiative, came for us. So we want to do good works for you, not to get to you, but because you've come to us. We want to get in on what you have for us to do for the rest of the lifetime we have. In Jesus' name, we celebrate you.